Hey, Mike.
Hello, Noah.
How you doing?
Pretty good, pretty good. Hello, my name is Mike Konczal. I'm a research fellow with the Roosevelt Institute, where I study financial reform, structural unemployment, and some other economic-related issues.
And my name is Noah Millman. I blog for The American Scene and for The Economist, and I am a former structured finance guy from my previous career on Wall Street.
And the last job I had before this one was a financial engineer out of the Bay Area in San Francisco. So we'll be touching
both
on
fairly share our share of the blame for the end of the world, as we know.
And we're both out too. We're both, I think, successfully out too. We're both in the blogging business now. And
Well, you're doing more than I am to try to make up for your sins of the past, and you have fewer sins of the past. So
let's not go.
So you win.
Okay. So the first thing, speaking of sins of the past catching up on everyone, evidently there was some problems with the way mortgages were securitized during the 2000s. So
Yes.
one of the big stories to break out of the past 2-3 weeks, something that was kind of percolating in the blogosphere for a couple months, is the wave of foreclosure fraud and the wave of basically the foreclosure crisis in general. So I'm going to talk about that for a minute or two, kind of catch up readers. There's been a lot of people who have been writing kind of high-level catch-up overviews because it's a very complicated topic. But one of the shortest way to approach it is that there's two problems. One is that people are being foreclosed on very quickly. And in judicial review states, so there's some states, there's 23 states, Florida is the big one here, that requires a judge to sign off on a foreclosure. And what turns out to have happened is, the people who are doing the foreclosing, the mortgage servicers, people working for the banks, and usually some of the largest banks are where this is concentrated, are foreclosing very quickly to the point where they are what's being called robo-signing documents, or more accurately, they're having people signing documents saying that these people have not paid their mortgages, but they didn't really review the documents.
Right.
And so you have people signing 10,000 of these foreclosure documents a month when you should normally spend a few hours a day, a few hours on each one. For the typical,
Or at least an hour, right?
Exactly. There should be some burden of proof here, and this is, perjury. This is a big problem.
It's not just a matter of burden of proof, right? You are testifying in court effectively, and if you haven't actually reviewed the documents, there's a very real risk that you were lying. Yeah.
Exactly. And so that has boiled up, and one of the big issues is that you have people saying that they've reviewed something called the note, which is part of the mortgage, and it's the actual terms of your mortgage. It's the actual debt of your mortgage. There's another part of your mortgage called a lien, which basically says if you don't pay the debt, we can take your property. But they're not going and getting the notes, and they're not presenting them to a judge. And there is now other worries saying that the notes aren't actually there, that when these mortgage bonds, these bonds full of mortgages, were created, that the notes weren't properly transferred to where they needed to go. Many of these places that were putting them together, especially in the very front end, were like, Mike and Noah's lending on the street corner in a bad neighborhood. And, there's worry, things that collapsed all in 2007. And there's real worry that these kind of fly-by-night operations didn't set up these bonds correctly, which would allow investors, the people who bought the bonds, to start to sue and demand money back. Because what you will notice at this point is, this is, from the point of view of people being foreclosed on, this is very difficult for a class action suit. Essentially, you're going to have a lot of people at the state levels, a lot of people with different types of claims. It's not going to be easy to organize them or get them to have some sort of legal accountability. And also there's a cultural norm, which we'll talk about whether or not we should feel sympathetic for someone who hasn't paid their mortgage in 8 months, but, wants to challenge their note, challenge the bank.
So in the background, right, we can sort of separate out sort of two different pieces of this. I think it's worth talking about both of them. One is sort of the base level justice question of sort of the people who are being foreclosed on they're claiming they're being foreclosed on incorrectly, or who are being foreclosed on more aggressively, even if arguably correctly, than would normally be the case. And the other side is sort of systemic issues, and like how does this this crisis relate, and potential responses to this crisis impact sort of the health of the financial system more generally. I think it's worth talking about both of those things to some extent separately. But in the background of all of this, right, is securitization changed the incentive structure of one side of this in the foreclosure process, right? So normally the lender right, if you live in a world before securitization, right, the originator, the lender, the servicer, these are all, either the same person or closely related, and they've got a very powerful alignment of interest, right? It doesn't make sense for the lender to foreclose more aggressively than necessary, right? Because they're going to be driving down the value of the property that is their security. It makes much more sense for them to negotiate with the borrower and come to a mutually workable arrangement. When that relationship is broken, right, that incentive is gone, and the servicer is now kind of hanging out on its own, able to make its own decisions, and it's not, particularly if it's been securitized, it's not clear that there's anybody who is in the position of the lender, right? Any one entity who sort of has both the economic incentive to say, let's work something out that's sensible for both sides, and the ability to make that happen, right?
Right. So, for the audience, if we've lost the audience, we're going to continuously bring it back a level. So, the best way to think of that is, what was Jimmy Stewart's bank's name in It's Wonderful Life?
It was Bailey Savings and Loan.
Bailey Savings and Loans. They classic. That's the kind of classic Jimmy Stewart bank. And up until the 1980s, or especially the late 1970s, that was very common that you would have a bank you could go to. And
building and loan, excuse me, not savings loan, building and loan.
Building and loan. So buildings, right? Exactly. The money's in the community. It's all of us and all this stuff. And there was a clear alignment. Like Jimmy Stewart was standing there, and he negotiated your mortgage in the first place, and if you fell behind, he could renegotiate you onto a good path.
Mm-hmm.
And the new system, the securitization system, where your mortgages are sliced and diced up into tranches, and and more importantly, split on the back end. So there's a pension fund in Sweden, and then the Chinese government, and a bunch of other people all have all are part owner of your mortgage because they all part own this bond of it. It's not clear if the people set up to manage the mortgage, which are different than the people who originated it, have any incentive to really make sure this happens. And there's really good arguments that they get paid more when things go bad. So there's actually incentives to not get you to a place where
you're talking about the servicers themselves.
Yeah, this is the servicers,
right?
So there's the lack of accountability in the middle of this great chain here. So
right. And okay, so the servicer historically, right, had an incentive, right, to be processing things, right? The more processing they do, the more they get paid, whether that's refinancing or foreclosing or whatever. If they're not pushing any interesting paper, they don't get paid anymore. If they push interesting paper, they get paid more. But it's not just that person is now a different person from the different entity from the entity that owns the mortgage, but that nobody owns. No single entity owns the mortgage, and it's not clear who has sort of the ability, if anyone has the ability, to take the position of the lender normally in this negotiation, as a matter of sort of their financial interests. We should say that there's a reason, or there's a public policy rationale for the securitization process existing in the first place, right, with respect to mortgages, and that is, if you are a community that's dependent on George Bailey's the Bailey Building and Loan, right? The pool of capital available for the Bailey Building and Loan is basically the savings of that community, right? And securitization made it possible to access a global pool of capital, and therefore made it much more possible to grow a community like Bedford Falls, that's what it's called, much more quickly if the economic opportunity arises. It also makes it much more easy to develop bubbles if the opportunity arises for those. But that's sort of the logic behind securitizing anything, right? Is that it makes it much more easy to access, to throw capital at it. You have access to a global pool of capital, and the instruments are theoretically more liquid in the aftermarket.
Right. And there's also an argument about diversification, because it's funny to say it out loud now, but 2003, 2005, a lot of arguments were made on the idea that we would never have a nationwide housing bubble, that we might have, a housing bubble in California, but it would be offset by more stable growth in New York or whatnot. And even though in some ways this is a housing crisis of 5 to 8 states, everywhere has had a little bit of a bubble. No one's really kind of leaned against it in the way that you would want something that's diversifiable to lean against. So in some ways it's tied everyone together in a much closer way. And I'm still not sure if this is a driver or not of the nationwide bubble, but when you have capital that can move to every part of the country, it also can move away from every part of the country, or also can distort every part of the country in a way that we quite frankly don't have a grip on yet.
Right. But so returning to the mortgage crisis, right, or the foreclosure crisis, the sort of the norms of the world of securitized finance, right, and particularly like the people who transact in the notes, create by notes I mean the debt issued by these vehicles that own, supposedly own piles of mortgages, right? The norms of that world and the norms of the world of the Bailey building and loan are very, very different, and that extends to the way documentation works, right? If you are Citibank and you have transacted in a derivative on a mortgage securitization with AIG to ensure the more senior portion of that securitization, you're two professionals working sort of with each other, and you've got teams of lawyers on both sides, and you've also got an incentive to make the transaction work, right? And so while you want every I dotted and every T crossed, right, you're also on some level, when you're putting the transaction together, in kind of the same boat, and you have similar incentive to to make sure that it all works out smoothly. And when it comes back to if it winds up coming into court, the court's going to look at it also as sort of two big boys in the room together. And I think if you read the Wall Street Journal editorial about the way sort of this is all just sort of paperwork and politics, right? What that reads very much to me like is a kind of imposition of those sorts of norms on this other world, right? We all know what the transaction was supposed to be, and we all agreed to the terms, and getting hung up on documentation details seems like sort of small ball, right?
Right. Like everyone knew what they were getting into, and really, why are we fighting? Like you all took a bet here, and
right.
It turned out not to work well.
And that's not the way a homeowner looks at it. They didn't, well, in some cases, it was the way, right? Somebody who's like buying a property in order to flip it, that probably is exactly the way they looked at it. But in general, that's not the way a homeowner looks at it. Is that they just took a bet.
Right. And then there's 2 points there. One is to look at it from the investor and the homeowner's point of view, is that the investor's also in the same boat. But a lot of it, without getting too technical, all this stuff is from the investor's point of view, who may or may not start suing to have these mortgages bought back at par for $1 on the dollar, even though they're only worth a quarter on the dollar. Is that it's governed by New York trust law, that it's not clear that Congress can, or the federal government can quite intervene here. And the laws surrounding the creation of these things are really specific, especially when it comes to this kind of stuff. So I mean, I understand the norm stuff, but I think when push comes to shove, the language and some states' trust law has intention, like we intended to put these notes here as very clear prerogatives. But from everything I understand, I'm not a lawyer and I have not looked at this, but I've talked to enough people at this point that says that that's not a feature of the New York trust law. It's actually some of the strongest laws, and that's one of the reasons why, besides the fact that Wall Street's there, is that New York law was selected for it. But to get back to the homeowner point of view, one argument I'm trying to develop is that there's a lot of people looking at this and say, okay, to some extent, this is good and all, but this is actually really destructive because you have homeowners in homes that they don't belong in. And at the end of the day, we need to get them out quicker rather than later. That this is holding up economic activity, that we need to get as many foreclosures or as many mutually voluntarily leaves of these homes so that people can move in, buy them, rebuild the neighborhoods, et cetera, et cetera. There's some things are more convincing than others. One is a kind of lucky ducky narrative that Wall Street Journal and some other people have put out that says, we should be, homeowners should be thanking the banks because they're getting these extra opportunities to live there when they shouldn't, and they get a nice vacation out of this, and in return, all they do is just have to leave at the end. And it's actually kind of the rationale of the Florida. They set up these extra courts to handle the foreclosure processes in Florida, and the judge was basically like, I don't think many of you will be able to live in your homes, but we're going to give you an extra couple months, and we'll call that a fair trade. And then there's another argument that comes out of Treasury and comes out of the Obama White House to some degree that says most of these foreclosed homes are abandoned, and they're basically an albatross on the neck of these communities. That most foreclosures are in a handful of states: California, Nevada, Arizona, Florida, Michigan, a little bit of Georgia. And these are also places that have very high unemployment, and the correlation between foreclosures and unemployment is very strong. The quicker we get these things churning back to a new normal, it is better for those communities. And what I want to argue, and give me a minute on this, is to say that we're looking at this backwards. We're putting the borrower in the front seat here, when really this is a sign of a sick system. Like, this is a brand new system. It's like a car. It's like a brand new car with a kind of brand new collision system. And, the airbags aren't deploying. The frame's not holding up when it hit this wall. When you look at other housing bubbles, when you look at like Texas in the 80s, the foreclosure rate, I was actually pulling this up, the foreclosure rate never really topped 5%.
Right.
Over the period, where right now we have like 12% in default. We have like a massive wave of foreclosures. And to me, that's a sign that something has gone wrong from the banking point of view, because it's all like the first rule is you never foreclose on a home from the point of view of a bank. And the second rule is you never foreclose on a home. These are you always lose value in this. And there's almost always a point in between what you would take over the house for and sell it at a discount and what the debt is that you can renegotiate.
So I think you got to separate two things, right? Sort of saying, well, we want to sort of foreclose a lot and very quickly in order to get us back to a new normal, right, and put a floor under the market, right, is conflating two things, right? The desire to get liquidity back into the market and enable real estate transactions to take place at prices that are realistic, and the the notion that sort of a wave of foreclosures is the way to get there, right? And again, if you think back to sort of the what would happen in a sort of pre-securitization world, right? What would have been the typical approach, right? The bank wouldn't necessarily foreclose, indeed would almost certainly not, jump to foreclosure, but they would not simply say, all right, we'll give you another 3 months, all right, we'll give you another 3 months, right? There'd be some kind of negotiation to change the term of the loan, or change the interest rate, or change the principal, or what have you, right, to turn this into something that they were more likely to get their money back on, right? You might even have a situation where where a borrower can be turned into a renter, right? Where the bank winds up owning the property, but providing a lease, to the current current owner. So there are lots of ways you could theoretically get into a more liquid situation where the homeowner could theoretically sell if there's no jobs there and they need to move, right? Without having abandoned property and whole and people on the street with their belongings. To do that, though, you need to have somebody on the other side of the table, right, who has the normal interests of a lender, right? And it's not clear that there's anybody, that any of the banks have that role, that they can play that role given securitization, but it's also not clear that the government can play that role, right? If the government sort of steps in and kind of imposes this, right, you've turned this from a situation where you've got a negotiation between two parties who have to a certain degree aligned interests and to a certain degree opposed interests, and they can come to a reasonable agreement, and turn it into something where you've got an outsider deciding sort of what a just outcome is in each situation. And I think that's part of what the sort of, let's call them sort of the Wall Street Journal crowd, or sort of anyone who's thinking about this from the perspective of the financial industry is particularly worried about, is sort of that, well, then all bets are off on where the game goes, if that sort of if that becomes the question.
Right. And it's important to realize that what you talk about with negotiations, the things that allow you to do good negotiations are local knowledge, expertise, time. I mean, it's a time and energy intensive thing to do. And the servicers, the people who are most in a place to do this stuff right now in the kind of new financial system we have, are the servicers are by by definition, by the way, what they sell their services is streamlined, automated, efficient, don't really exist anywhere. Could be moved to India, could be moved to Kentucky, wherever. It's the kind of work that does not, independent of any type of mal-aligned incentives or bad legal structures. It's just not a good business model for doing this kind of thing. It's designed to take payments in one door and walk them to the other door. And it's also was conceived that way in part because of tax law, in part because that's just how you would want something like this to work. So it's like a car without an airbag. And so to get
right, but I guess what I'm saying is sort of if you you're not going to be able to create by fiat, right, the Bailey building and loan, right, or the functions you want out of that, right. The government can't wave a magic wand and say we're gonna call out of the earth the people with the local knowledge and so on and so forth. The real question is what you could do to change the incentives, right, within among the players who already exist, right.
Let's back up for 1 second.
Yeah.
So the two big approaches that people have taken, one is to say, okay, bankruptcy judges have this local information. And in an extreme version, you could do something that we'll call mortgage bankruptcy. I think Adam Levitin and a couple other consumer law people put this forward in 07, 06 and said, we don't want to encourage people to go into bankruptcy because it's going to screw up car debt and gets the auto dealers involved, which will piss them off. But basically what you want is some sort of way for a bankruptcy judge to act as the George Bailey character here and say, okay, here's what you can pay, here's what the bank's point of view is. I'm going to rewrite the terms of your mortgage for you. Mm-hmm. And consumer takes a bad penalty because he went through bankruptcy and his credit's destroyed, it's a public record, blah blah blah. The bank is entitled to a certain part of the upside, and if it's not, we can restructure it this way, so it kind of has a little bit of a call option in the new equity that will be built. But there's some sort of, and say, okay, bankruptcy judges, for better or worse, are going to be the best approximation of this function. And then the second thing, and the one you're seeing momentum on, Center for American Progress is pushing this, and I think it's a good idea, is to have basically mortgage counselors at the state level. Mm-hmm. I'm a big fan of things that can be implemented at the state level because it avoids the Senate, and because in some ways it's very much a state problem. Mm-hmm. It hits states with varying degrees, and so Nevada's problem is different than Nebraska's problem, and Nevada has a huge problem. You might want to take a more aggressive approach. So it's kind of setting up mortgage counselors. Now, I imagine mortgage counselors, of course, are not going to be as well aligned as Bank of America is, but at the end of the day, it's more an issue of finality here. From the point of view of the consumer, is that you have a lot of people with HAMP and with these kind of programs that are designed to incentivize the servicer. It's not clear what's actually happening a lot of the time. You have people strung along for 6 months and then drop from the program.
Right. I understand what you're saying, and I think from the perspective, if you look at it just from the perspective of sort of consumers caught in the foreclosure process, right, that clearly it's a good thing for them to have someone who's on some level an advocate, right, like a mortgage counselor, to solve their problem for them, right, and dictate terms to their lender, right. You can understand why, from the perspective of sort of anyone on the other side of the desk, right, that's kind of a scary prospect.
I can't imagine why that'd be a scary prospect.
Right. So I think
yes,
what I guess I would throw on the table, and I'm not an expert at this, and I haven't studied sort of the various bits of sort of legislation that are being thrown around, right? But it seems to me what you need is something that creates a powerful financial incentive for the owners of servicers, right? Since most of the big servicers are now owned by much bigger companies, right? Something that creates a big financial incentive for them to to enter into a process like this, right? And that was sort of what they tried the first time, and it didn't work, right? I'd be curious to understand from you, like, why, what was missing from the first round of this, right, where they tried to, incentivize modifications.
So the theory, there's usually two theories that argue why it broke. And one is that the servicers were in the driver's seat, but as we talked about earlier, the servicers' incentives aren't clearly aligned with either investors or borrowers. They're aligned with themselves, and they're aligned with their parent company, which is important for the second reason. So there's, from their point of view, it's not hard to imagine that it's most profitable for them to string people along for 6 months and then drop them from the program. And that might also be good from a PR point of view because they can release press statements saying that they're participating, yada, yada, yada. so many trial modifications have been started, but it doesn't actually change the bottom line for them.
Right.
Now, on some level, that's a good story, especially if you amp up how much the servicers get paid in terms of foreclosures and distressed and non-current homes. The other part of the story that usually gets emphasized, it's one that I emphasize a little bit more than many, is the second lien problem. And it's a headache for a lot of people. But long story short is that mortgages in the U.S. are unique among debt that you can have multiple parties take out. You can take out loans with multiple banks without telling each other. So you can get a second mortgage on your house right now, and the person who owns your first mortgage does not have to sign off on it. That doesn't exist in the corporate world for very good reasons, because it's kind of an invitation for abuse on a lot of people's parties. And the short story is that, and if you wanted to write down the debt, if you wanted to write down the principal to a thing that was manageable, you would normally have to extinguish or just completely wipe out your home equity line of credit, your mortgage that's on top of your original mortgage. These second mortgages, these junior mortgages, these home equity lines of credit, there's a lot of different types, are half owned by the 4 or 5 largest banks, who also own the servicers. And so the servicers, this is actually a stat I just saw recently, is that of people who are not paying their mortgage, their first mortgage, 60% of them are paying a junior lien in some form, usually a home equity line of credit.
Right, but here's what I don't understand about the argument you're making, right, is that it would seem to me that would be a really powerful incentive not to foreclose, right? Because as long as you're making payments of some kind, or even if you're not making payments of some kind, but as long as nobody has initiated action, you're in the category of delinquent, and we can carry this second lien at some value, right? Once you go in and foreclose, right, those loans are going away, and what you're left with is the property. So it seems to me, if the problem is that servicers are too aligned with the interests of second lien holders, you would think that what you would see is basically no action on foreclosures, so that all these loans stay outstanding and can be carried at some value. And we're seeing exactly the opposite.
Well, yeah, you're right. You're exactly right. That you're able to hold the second lien on the book at a high value. And it also acts as essentially a call option on the debt, even if it was written down, if it's still there, or a call option on the equity. If you look at it, the foreclosures aren't scaling at the same pace as delinquent mortgages are. And there's this whole theory about whether or not we should talk about a crisis of strategic non-foreclosure as opposed to strategic default, about the fact that banks are holding a lot of people. Banks have a lot of people delinquent that they're not initiating foreclosing procedures on.
Right.
And they would argue that there's natural backlog in the system, that it's not scalable. But I think that matches up with a second lien story.
Right, but it doesn't match up with the foreclosure crisis story, right? Like if you describe the story as, we've got a foreclosure crisis, too many people are being foreclosed upon too quickly because servicers don't care, right? They don't know anything about these people. They don't care anything about these people. They also don't know anything or care anything about the lender, right? They're just trying to generate fees. But on the other hand, you have another story that says, well, actually, foreclosures are happening too slowly. There's not enough foreclosures happening relative to the huge volume of delinquencies, right? Those two stories, I mean, on some level, they could both be true in that the servicers could be sort of behaving badly in both directions simultaneously, but they can't both be true as sort of aggregate stories about our economic situation, right? You could have simultaneously all kinds of situations of injustice where people are being foreclosed upon incorrectly or where they're acting too aggressively, and all sorts of other situations where the banks are playing games with their balance sheets, making it look like they have more performing loans than not by not foreclosing, right? But in aggregate, one or the other is predominating. So in aggregate, we either have too much foreclosure or too little.
Right. Yeah, so that does make sense. And they don't have to be entirely mutually exclusive, because the first problem is really a problem of certain firms, certain outsourced firms. Mm-hmm. But you could still have a problem where the process is breaking down, where it's also still not being used enough from the point of view of certain entities in the system. So that's you're right that it's a huge problem out there. So you have 1 out of 10 homes that are delinquent right now. So it's I think there's enough space to contain both stories, but I do agree with you that they don't point to the same obvious story.
One thing that I think is sort of interesting to think about, just from a big picture perspective, is when the financial crisis first sort of exploded, right, and Congress passed the TARP legislation. The original intent of the TARP legislation was to buy up these securities, right? The idea was, there's some value here. Nobody's really sure exactly what it is, but we're going to stick our finger in the air and say, well, whatever the real hit to these securities is, it looks worse than it really is because we also have a liquidity crisis right now. So the government will step in and buy, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of this, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of this stuff, and thereby put a floor into the market, but also clean up the balance sheets of all these entities. And that didn't happen, right? Instead, the government infused capital directly into the banks, right? And the argument was sort of a combination of, well, if you buy the securities that you don't, then basically, you're taking a bet that these things are being priced right by these banks. That's a big gift, to the banks, right? And you don't have any leverage over the banks afterwards, right? If you buy into the banks, then you have some leverage. Right. The flip side of it, right, is that if a huge percentage of this market was owned by the government, right, then you would have an entity that could rip open these structures and suddenly be in the position of a lender, right? Right.
That was also, just to back up, that was also in a sense, the Geithner plan, or something called PPIP, which was going to use FDIC. This was in April of 2009. So well after TARP. There was a second round to try to get FDIC and Treasury to have direct ownership. Well, we had some hedge funds that was direct ownership, but please continue. Yeah, this was obviously very much in people's minds.
Yeah. So, all the sort of reasons why that didn't happen, why the government, on some level it did happen in that the Fed now, effectively owns a whole lot of this stuff, through, the strategy of quantitative easing, right? They own a whole bunch of stuff has been put to the Fed window that is backed ultimately by these kinds of mortgages. But, the government, the Treasury doesn't own, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of these securities, so they're not sitting at the table directly. All the reasons why that didn't happen, and the government didn't go that route are still valid. But it is interesting to note, right, that some of what's happening now, right, is a result of the fact that those, the works are still gummed up by the fact that there's no lender, right? That the lender is an amorphous cloud of institutions and individuals, and that's not ideal for cleaning up bad loans. And the government really doesn't have a good lever for inserting itself so long as that's the case, it seems to me. I don't know.
You know what the most interesting policy for potential that someone floated? So you're right that the government could buy these mortgage-backed securities and write them down. However, by definition, it would almost certainly overpay for them, and that's a very obvious, bailout for banks and and for consumers as well. Brad Miller, congressman from North Carolina, argued in a New Republic argument that the government has the right to use eminent domain to purchase mortgage-backed securities at par, or I'm sorry, not at par, at market clearing values. So for much less than they're currently being held on the books for. And then these things are being held.
How does that work? I don't know very much about eminent domain, but I'm surprised.
I don't know enough. As floated is that the government can purchase things that's in the Constitution as long as it compensates. The issue is compensation. Like how much would the government pay for these? If the government's willing to pay enough, every bank would sell it to them. It's arguably what's happening with the Federal Reserve. You could argue, but that the argument would be that you would. I would put a link up to Brad's editorial. It was from some months ago, so I don't remember the specifics. But that the government's obligation is only to pay mark to market, which is what the banks aren't using as their currency. So,
well, there is no market for this stuff, right?
Right.
So mark to market is sort of a fiction.
Yeah.
Right.
But so is what it's being recorded at right now.
Right.
So Yes, that's the only possible interjection of the government, because I was a huge critic of PPIP. I thought it was the wrong way to approach it. And I think ultimately right now it put us in a bind because we would have overpaid for something. We would have to debate whether as a public we want to like robo-foreclose on people in order to kind of recoup our losses.
Right, but if the argument that foreclosure is the wrong way to recover value, right, that it's actually counterproductive, right, is true, right, then you wouldn't be in that situation from a social perspective. I think, like I said, I think sort of the difficulties with pricing were there before. They're the reason it didn't happen the first time, and those problems are still there, right? But if the paramount goal is putting a floor under this whole process while doing the minimum amount of social disruption to the individual communities, right? And some of these communities already have gone away, right? But you want to minimize the degree to which you have, empty buildings with, crack houses inside, or I guess now it would be crystal meth houses inside.
Because in order to segue to the next topic, many
Right.
of these communities have incredibly high levels of unemployment.
Right.
And there is a big debate about what is going on with unemployment in this country. And I wrote a paper about a month ago, which I'm going to summarize very quickly for us, and says a few things. One is that for the first time, as far as anyone can tell, going back at least to the 60s, it is more likely that the unemployed are going to drop out of the labor force than find a job.
Right.
Which is going to have huge implications for us as we come into the recovery. Even if we assume that there's not going to be a double dip, there's a large percentage of the population that is essentially hidden from our normal unemployment records, both our records and our normal policy responses. And as there's debate about what terms to use here, I'm uncomfortable saying people's human capital stagnates as they leave looking for labor, but something's going on. They're becoming detached from the normal labor mechanisms. And the other thing is that we tried to make an argument, and I think it was I thought it was successful, that this is not simply a supply-side problem. There is still a demand problem. We see this because for involuntary part-time labor, so people who are working part-time when they want to be working full-time, is up, and it's the highest percentage of the working population we've ever seen, and it's also up in every type of both occupation and sector. And so what that says to me is that when you have someone who's working part-time, but wants to work full-time, it means they have at least some skills. So this isn't a matter of someone needs to know a little bit of math to do their job, but doesn't know any. They have at least some skills, and they're also not distorted by unemployment insurance, which is a big kind of fireball in these debates, that they're, at least to the first approximation, not collecting unemployment insurance, and certainly, and this is not disincentivizing them from working more hours. So I still think that this was a little bit more of a contentious debate a few months ago than it is now. I think the side that I'm arguing for, the Paul Krugman side, who has ultimately at least won most of this debate, says that there's still room for government response. That if we could actually get another stimulus out the door, it would do good things. It wouldn't just be the government reallocating resources from point A to point B. Right.
I'm not. This is going to sound a little bit weird, but I'm not sure what the counter argument is to the claim that we have a big demand side problem domestically, right? When people talk about structural unemployment, what they mean usually by that is that you've got, changes in the structure of the economy that take a certain amount of time to work through, and you've got a lot of people in certain industries, and those industries are declining, and they need to be retrained, retooled for sort of, for other industries. Until that happens, there's going to be a certain amount of transitional unemployment, right? And you always get more of that in recessions than otherwise, right? Manufacturing employment drops more steeply, right, in recessions than it rises, in recoveries, right? And that's because, people, firms take advantage of recessions to take actions that would be maybe more difficult to take during periods of tight labor markets, to reorganize their businesses and recessions provide, in some ways, an excuse for getting rid of jobs that they might have wanted to get rid of anyway, but couldn't do when business was going like gangbusters. So you always have more of that, but there have been a whole bunch of analyses of the current unemployment situation that kind of, and I think Ben Bernanke himself said in his most recent speech that there's no good way to make that kind of transitional unemployment explain any more than a fraction of the unemployment that we see. That still leaves open the question of kind of what exactly the levers are that the government has, right, to to directly alleviate the problem of unemployment, right?
Before we continue on, I just want to throw out the arguments that I've seen are most convincing are twofold. One is, obviously that there's a growing education premium, and that our workforce is not as educated as the demand requires, and the IMF put that at 0.5%. I don't know if that's correct or not, but let's just ballpark it at 0.5%. And they gave another
0.5% of unemployment is due to that.
Yeah, 0.5% of the rise. So if you think that the natural rate of unemployment was 5%, it's now 6.5%. This is kind of the strongest version I've heard. The other 1% is basically mortgage debt hangover, and that they correlate the other part with foreclosures, which also correlates with communities that are just very much underwater that had the biggest housing bubble. And there's not a great causation story there, because wherever you see, obviously these places that had a huge housing bubble overinvested in construction, certain types of labor that are
right.
But they also had the biggest retrenchment of state budgets. So you have teachers being laid off, which causes kind of cascading effects. And so I do think that there's a story there, and it's why you would see, and I think it's very convincing locally. Like, it explains why Nevada is like a complete mess. It has like 14% unemployment or something.
Right. Although what you'd expect to see, right, if you had really bad regional situations in, let's say, Las Vegas area and Phoenix area and so forth, right, what you'd expect to see is an acute municipal crisis, right, as you have a huge amount of out-migration, right, from those areas, and suddenly your tax base has shrunk, and you've got this, you have a Detroit-type situation where you have a city built for 2 million people, and we only have 900,000 people in it, but you don't have a nationwide unemployment crisis because of that, unless you have, a nationwide, classic recession, right, which we do. So I don't buy into the story that sort of, this is the other thing to say about construction, right, is that there was a very large percentage, it's obviously not a majority, but a large percentage of immigrant labor in the construction industry specifically, and you've seen a big shift in migratory patterns, at least in the first couple of years after the financial crisis, right, as a result of that. So you had people going home, to Mexico or El Salvador or what have you, or not coming in the same numbers in that period. So you would think that would also, to some extent, alleviate the degree to which, right, the unemployment crisis is sort of structurally related to the construction industry specifically.
It's actually ironic that there's good evidence, or there's good arguments that if we had built a wall on Mexico or increased border security, it makes it harder for people to migrate back home as opposed to come this way. And if it had been built in 2006, it essentially would have kept a lot of people here that naturally would have wanted to go home as part of the recession. Yeah. So it would have done the exact opposite of what the nativists really wanted, which I always thought was amusing. But anyway, yes, what can be done about this is very discouraging. I'd like you to talk about it for a little bit.
Well, I mean, I think sort of the unspoken, if you read sort of Bernanke's, academic work, right? He was his argument always was, that the Fed always can do more, right? If the goal is to generate demand, the Fed can always do it, right? It has the tools at its disposal to, in the analogy that gave him his nickname, right? The Fed could always just fly over people with a helicopter and drop money on them, right? And you will definitely increase, reduce the value of money then, which will cause people to spend in exchange for goods and services instead of hoarding cash, right? So that's theoretically what he believes. Right, and if you take that at face value, then he believes he can solve the unemployment crisis, tomorrow. What he said in his speech, and which I think he really believes, is that there's, the Fed's credibility would be devastated if they made if they did something literally like that, if they literally flew around with helicopters dropping money on people, right, people would lose confidence in the value of the dollar, and and that would swamp any effort to increase demand, right? You'd have a whole new level of crisis, because people wouldn't believe in the value of money at all. They wouldn't simply believe, oh, the Fed's only trying to get inflation up to 3% or 4% or whatever for a short time being. They would believe, oh, the Fed's going nuts. And more to the point, when you say sort of people, right, we're to some extent talking about ordinary savers in the United States, but to some extent we're talking about the central banks of China and Japan, right? And I think sort of that international dimension kind of can't be ignored. There's an alignment of interest between there is obviously a not perfect alignment of interest between debtors and lenders, in any situation, right? And the government can lean more in one direction or more in the other direction, put their thumb on the scale more towards debtors, put the thumb on the scale more towards lenders, and there are all sorts of different pressure points within our system that work that way and always have. When a substantial fraction of your debt is held, internationally, this is no longer a domestic political debate, right? It's no longer we've got the populists or progressives against conservatives or banks and trusts or whatever, what have you, arguing over who is more important to the future of the nation and who deserves a break today. But you've got the concern about how who is going to finance, who oversees the pool of savings overseas is going to finance the substantial fiscal deficits the United States faces. So I think that when Bernanke talks about the Fed's credibility, that's what's in the background, is the sense that this is the U.S. doesn't have full freedom of action at this point to manipulate its economy the way it might ideally want to in some hypothetical world.
What's your take on the China peg battle?
I've always taken a different perspective, I think, than a lot of people, and certainly than Paul Krugman, right? Krugman seems, periodically he gets on a real sort of, tear about the China peg, right? And it's always seemed to me that the real risk to the United States is not, that China, continues to keep its currency, reasonably stable versus the dollar, but that you have a crisis where the Chinese currency rapidly revalues upward versus the dollar, right? That would have a devastating effect on America. I mean, it would be caused by a loss of confidence internationally in the United States, right? And would mean a dramatic inability by the United States, to borrow at anything resembling the rates that we borrow today. And so it seems to me, China's development path has been very, very different from Japan and South Korea's, right? If you look at the companies that are doing most of the exporting, and that are part of the sort of Ricardian integration across the Pacific, right, whereby, certain parts of the value chain have all migrated, to China, and you have, things designed in the United States and then, manufactured in China and then, marketed in the United States. It's not, in Japan's case, it was these huge industrial firms, right, that were intimately connected with banks and so on and so forth. In China, and the same thing happened in South Korea. In China's case, it's mostly really small and mid-sized firms, zillions of little firms in southern China that are the core of their export engine, right? And the big industrial sort of conglomerates, which China does have, and which frequently have sort of a state component to their ownership and a close connection with state banks, right, aren't the big drivers of export growth. I think the China peg story and what that has to do with China's own development is very different from the way it's frequently described. And I think the Chinese would say, if you ask them, that in many ways we're more at risk than they are. from that unraveling badly.
Right. And what I always look at, or what I also look at, is it's not clear to me if it's worth fighting out the currency policy based on the estimates of what we'll gain from it. So if you think of it as pros and cons, obviously the international stability is a major con, and it has that kind of tail risk that always worries me, where this could actually cause an escalation and cause other kind of political economy problems. But on the plus side, even if it's executed very well, J.W. Mason at New Deal 2.0, we'll try to put a link up to this. He went through where the current research is and says, maybe this will boost GDP 0.5% over a couple of years.
Right.
Maybe. Frost, what's his first name, at American Scene has been writing about this as well.
Walker Frost, yeah.
Walker Frost has been writing about this as well. Says, the upside is not really that strong. I mean, there is an upside, right? There is a maladjustment, if you will. If you want to go into currency war language, there's obviously a maladjustment or misadjustment of currency regimes. But if you look at how much ground you'll gain from fighting this war, is it enough to bury the bodies that you'll get out of it? And it's not clear to me that it is. And so, when you look at Keynes, the argument for a lot of this currency policy, it's not, as you said about Bernanke, you can always do more to stimulate demand. It's not clear to me that this is a necessary precondition of getting us out of the slump.
Well, if you think we have a crisis of demand, right? If you think that we're at, if you think we're at 10% unemployment instead of, let's say, 7% unemployment, right? If you think 7% would be a good, if we didn't have a national recession, but we did have, this big real estate, construction, rationalizing going on, right? So there was an increase in structural unemployment, but we didn't have massive national recession on top, right? If you think 3% of our unemployment is just weak demand, right? Then the simple answer is to say, yeah, well, what we need to do is generate more demand, and however you do it is good. So if you don't think that's a necessary precondition, right, where do you start?
Oh, no, I'm in the same boat. So I think that this might get us somewhere in demand in terms of the currency, the currency readjustment. But I'm always very sensitive to the political economy of a lot of this stuff.
Right.
And it's not been clear to me that the upside would come close to balancing out potential downsides. So I would like to see a little bit more specific math, especially from people who are agitating from this, a little bit more specifics.
Well, what are the other irons in the fire?
I mean, if I really did. Oh, okay. So I see what you're saying. Well, there aren't any really, right? I mean, and it's not clear to me that there'll be. I think there'll be many less after the November election. I mean, so one thing is to take.
Well, theoretically, let's leave out the November election. Let's imagine we're rolling back 9 months or something, right?
Sure.
What are the policy irons we really have in the fire to, right? If you think I'm right, and the Fed feels, and the Fed's position is not simply, well, we're, horrible banker people, and so we want to screw, homeowners and the unemployed, and we want to make sure that the domestic interests that are, that are aligned with lenders, benefit on a relative basis, even if on an absolute basis everybody suffers, right? If you assume that's not true, and the Fed's worried about its own credibility for really good reasons, right? Then what are your other policy levers?
Well, I do think that the states bleeding out is a big issue.
Mm-hmm.
And I think earlier and more aggressive moves, and I didn't catch it at the time, but that's a fault of a lot of people, I think, was to basically backstop the states in some way, take over whatever nationalize and federalize whatever entitlement programs you want from the state level to get it off their books. Ultimately, the progressive movement needs to move into a point where the social safety network is run through the federal government. That's part of a broader picture, but I think this would have been a good time to do it. I think it would have made fiscal sense to do it. There are problems with the way states administer their budgets, but the entitlement programs are something that would have naturally moved to a federal solution. There's a couple different ways to go around new stimulus programs, but in continuing the infrastructure, people are now. It's one of those things where I think when it came time for the stimulus program, people didn't quite think of how to actually spend money. I think you're actually now starting to see really smart policy initiatives. In terms of the Fed,
what sorts of things are you talking about? I mean,
one thing I saw really interesting was something called dignity bonds. I think that's what it's called from New America. Michael Lynn's people put that out. Basically, it's a work voucher for the elderly. So the elderly basically get work vouchers that they can assign to people to, like, take them to the store, to clean their house, et cetera, et cetera. And it's run through a kind of private company. Basically, the person in question would pay half of it, and then the other person and the government would pay the other half. It's like $10 an hour or whatever. And so it's a kind of elderly care.
Right.
One thing I'm conscious of is that a lot of the stimulus programs are very masculinist. So it's like we hire people to go build this bridge, and it emphasizes a certain type of person and a certain type of labor. And here is something that's much more service focused.
Right.
So if you think that a nice,
although to be fair, if you look at where sort of unemployment has spiked, right, it's spiked much, much faster and harder among men than among women.
Absolutely.
Right? There's like a good reason for it. I mean, one of these sort of, like, again, in the background structural questions, right, is kind of every time we have a recession, right, quote unquote guy jobs get hit, worse than, quote unquote pink collar jobs, and in the recovery they recover less well. So that's like that's sort of a structural shift in the economy generally.
Yeah, no, I'm not signing up for like the end of men hypothesis or anything like that. But one nice side effect of that one for the stimulus program is that it sets people up with skills and career paths, and it's certain that healthcare will grow as a sector of our economy. So, but it's very difficult to kind of come up with a WPA for medical work that's other than job training kind of stuff.
Right.
So
well, there's always Brad DeLong's healthcare plan. I don't know if you remember the
I don't remember.
Yeah, he sort of floated it semi-facetiously in, I think, 2006 or 2007. It was before. I'm pretty sure it was before the Obama administration. And it took a lot of flack because it had a big component for a version of sort of medical savings accounts as part of it. There was a medical savings account portion. There was a sort of national single payer catastrophic high deductible plan portion, and then there was a piece where he's like, and I want to levy a bunch of sin taxes on alcohol and soda and cigarettes and whatever else is bad for you, and use that to hire, as he put it, an army of barefoot nurses to go basically door to door providing healthcare services at a price cheaper than free. Right, arguing that kind of the transaction costs associated with getting access to healthcare are high enough for some people that even when nominally they have access to it, they don't have access to it, and therefore there'd be big public health gains, which translate into economic gains to shoving the services at them. I do tend to think that over a longer span of time, looking at over a decade or two. That employment in sort of the healthcare and quasi-healthcare sector inevitably is going to, explode. It's going to be interesting to see how the politics of that shape up, depending on what the government's role is in being the actual employer. And I would assume, America being America, that the politics will be uglier the greater degree that the government is the direct employer. But that would be. Right. If you wanted sort of an image of a WPA style, initiative, that's what it would look like. We certainly wouldn't see people painting murals.
Right. It's actually interesting now. If you look back at some of the stuff that was done during the New Deal, it's stuff like Google does now. It's stuff that we've already set up things to do. So it's if you go back, you can find like the most detailed records of consumption of what, because they just hired people to go around and ask people what they were buying. So like historical economists spend a lot of time with the New Deal information, just because it was like, okay, well, what can we hire? What are shovel ready projects? We'll go around and ask people what they're doing right now. So We have a little bit of time left. I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about financial reform as we kind of recap the first 2 years of the Obama administration. There's something in the New York Times about how they feel that the first chapter's over, and the Obama administration is already freaking out about how it's kind of over in terms of what they can accomplish.
Yeah, which I think is kind of I don't know, it's kind of silly, right?
Yes.
I mean, the administration is still going to be there. And if you look at, the Clinton administration or the Reagan administration or any other administration that suffered, big reverses after 2 years in their legislative position, there's plenty of accomplishment, right, that you can point to years afterwards. So, it's difficult for me. It's difficult for me to see the logic of that kind of self-pity, really. And if you want to make an argument about ways that structurally our political system has changed so that, post-1982 Reagan administration or the post-1994 Clinton administration aren't, good analogies to, what the Obama administration could accomplish from here on, then you should be turning that argument into a fighting argument, and why you should reorganize, in response, to that change in the structure of our political system. But be that as it may,
I think you'll see some movement on the quote unquote constitutional option in the Senate, which basically allows them to rewrite the laws with a simple majority at the beginning of the session. And I know I've noticed people are really starting to weaponize arguments against the Senate in much more sophisticated ways.
Well, certainly, like on the edges on the left, they've been doing that sort of for a while, and you saw sort of a version of that on the right in the early years of the Bush administration when they were when the right was up in arms about not getting enough judges through, right? So I think you always get on the sort of the activist end of things a certain degree of why can't we just sort of clear the brush and reorganize things so that our current majority has more leverage than it does in our system. I think you need to figure out how to make, if you really believe those sorts of arguments, right, you need to figure out how to take them out of that realm of we can't get our ideas through because X, right, and make a very different kind of case, to the American people. But be that as it may, you asked about financial reform.
Yeah, so of the three big initiatives of the Obama administration, the stimulus, health care, and financial reform, I always feel like financial reform gets the least amount of coverage and the least amount of sense that something really was a game changer. Part of that is, just that it's very difficult. Part of it's natural cynicism and how compromised a lot of people thought it was, myself included. You wrote a thing at the American Scene that kind of just gave a high-level overview that I really liked because I thought it was, here are 8 things it impacts, and here's a rough read on them. So I'd like you to talk a little more about the bill.
Well, we don't have very much time, so I'm least well informed about sort of the consumer protection side of it, and probably most sort of boringly inclined to just sort of think, yeah, sure, we should have a stronger, consumer protection agency there. It's not a very sort of deeply thought out opinion. The sort of philosophical thing where I had the most concern about, right, was sort of punting a whole bunch of questions to, and I understand why they did this, but punting a whole bunch of questions to the Basel process on the grounds that, if America gets out of sync with sort of the international consensus on bank regulation, then we'll just be disadvantaging our banks versus international banks, and we'll hurt ourselves without actually gaining anything from it. So I sort of understand the logic of that, but the result was, right, that you got coming out, Basel III kind of doubles down on sort of the existing philosophy of bank regulation, which is let's try to measure risk really accurately, right? And wherever we see risk, let's make it really, really expensive, right? So that banks are incentivized to run, very, very low risk portfolios. And that's always struck me as a dangerous incentive structure, right? And I think in the wake of this crisis, it should be really obvious that it's a dangerous incentive structure. And so doubling down on it makes me very, very nervous. Even if we do better at measuring risk, right? And even if the sort of the specific things that caused the crisis don't recur, and even if some of the newfangled elements, like a sort of a countercyclical capital requirement, work, and I'm sort of skeptical that they'll actually work, but it's there. And the reason is, right, if you make it very, very expensive to hold risk, right, you can only make money by taking risk, right? The notion that banks can make any significant amount of money being truly pure service businesses, right, I think is a fallacy, right? And it's also not what banks are for, right? The purpose of banking is to turn savings into capital, right? If you don't need banks to do that, then you don't need banks at all, right? You could disaggregate what banks do into things that, places like Google and Microsoft could do, right? If all we're doing is sort of providing, services to people to figure out how they connect with the capital markets, right? Then you would have a very different business model and a very different regulatory architecture. The reason you need banks and bank regulations is that people put their savings to a certain extent in banks, and that's how it gets that pool of savings gets turned into capital that can use that can be used to grow the economy. And the only way you can make money doing that is by taking risk. Right, so you tell the banks, we're going to make it very, very expensive for you to take any risk. The incentive you set up is not don't take any risk, but don't take any risk that I can see. Right, only take risks that are invisible. Right, and that's very much what you saw all through the last decade. Right, leading up to the banking crisis, was a very strong preference for apparently risk-free transactions. Right, banks ballooned their balance sheets enormously, but they kept a lot of off balance sheet through, a variety of different specialized vehicles, right? And set up all sorts of trades that looked like they were, riskless. You have, enormously high rated counterparty hedging, enormously high rated instrument, right? And thereby quote unquote guaranteeing an income stream, right? And all, there's a tail risk on all of those, and measuring the tail risk is impossible, right? So you have something that from any of the tools that we have, right, wouldn't show up as, whether it's value at risk or any other tool, wouldn't show up as having any risk. And instead there was an enormous amount of risk, hiding there. Obviously, you're probably not going to have the crisis in exactly the same place, but you get the same philosophy of how you're going to regulate the banks, which is, fundamentally emphasizing on let's find the risk and charge for that. I feel like you're going to wind up getting yourself into the same problem. I would have liked to see the approach go exactly the opposite direction, which is to say, be much more aggressive about minimum capital requirements, right, and much more aggressive about finding, and closing the holes of how you get around those, right, ways of moving things off balance sheets that don't show up as when you're calculating how much capital the bank needs, right. Really focus on that end of it, and on the risk end, nobody blew up because they had too much, high yield debt on their books, right? They blew up because they had AAA debt that wasn't really AAA. Right. So why are we responding by saying, well, let's increase the amount of capital you need to hold against things that aren't rated or against things that have low ratings, right? It should be the other way around. Let's find the things that look like they don't have any risk, and let's increase the capital charge on those.
Right. So the baseline is why we have risk-adjusted capital here, because if you have a baseline, that if you don't charge for risk, then it distorts how people hold. If you put pressure on one end or the other, it's going to change things. So, like if you have to hold the same capital if you're lending against GE versus internet startup, it's going to distort the way you lend capital out. And
right.
I agree with you in the sense that there should be a two-tier approach. One is just a baseline capital versus total liabilities, like what you're saying, complemented with the risk stuff. Because at the end of the day, like I focus out a little bit more and say, well, the problem is, why was that thing rated AAA? And why do we have securitizations that were set up to kind of collapse in a certain, one would argue, predictable way?
Right.
Much like the reasons we talked about earlier. With one person said that a lot of what you're seeing in the securitization part of this law is trying to get the George Bailey regulation and kind of common sense stuff into the capital markets, which is just not at all a good place for it. Like it completely defies that kind of individualized local knowledge. And so how do you find that balance between the two? We put out a report that talked about capital requirements, which, it's the more you talk to people, the more you can kind of get completely different opinions on what's the strengths and weaknesses of Basel III. We put out a report that argued that countercyclical will actually make it worse because you need a higher return on equity to keep up on that. And, it'll basically encourage people to find the riskiest stuff at the height of the bubble. People will it's obvious the way they'll outguess it, which I found partially convincing. So, yeah, it's not clear how well the capital regimes will work. I mean, given what it is, I think it's strong. I think it tackles some of the obvious problems in the old regime, which was, the ways to game it is to basically borrow very short term, like finance everything on a credit card instead of a 30-year mortgage because you can turn it over easier, and until you can't, and then it blows up. And it also it covers that in a way that I thought was fairly convincing, which was good because it was an obvious problem for this kind of new capital markets banking.
Right. I think if you want to talk about sort of the politics of it, and you said sort of the thing that people talk about least is financial reform, right? And I think it's partly that the subject is abstruse, but I think it's also that the only way people can really evaluate it, right, and whether it quote unquote worked, right? There's two ways they could evaluate. An ordinary person, who's not conversant with the issues could evaluate financial reform, right? They could evaluate it based on tangible results, right? So if I think financial reform is about making it possible for my small business to get credit when I couldn't get it before, or for me to get a mortgage when I couldn't get it before, although I could have gotten it 2 years before that without any questions being asked, right? Then if financial reform changes that in my life, I'm happy. And it's very unlikely that any of what's done really directly impacts that situation. And the other way is sort of who is mad about it, right? If everybody seems happy about it, right, then, then why would anyone believe that it is, a response, a successful response to, gross malefaction, right? And I have an instinctive aversion, to populist arguments, right? And I think, populism sort of by definition is sort of, exceptionally, prone to demagoguery and therefore bad outcomes, lose-lose outcomes. And that's populism of the left or of the right. But nonetheless, I kind of get the basic logic of, well, if I feel, if I'm mad because, this entity screwed me, right, and appears to have screwed everybody, right, and you've passed this big reform bill and, that same entity doesn't seem terribly upset about it, right, why would I believe that you did anything to solve the problem? And so to that extent, I guess I sort of understand the sort of the self-pitying arguments of some of the Obama folks saying, we tried too hard to get it right, and didn't worry enough about the politics. I think that's a particularly self-serving way of putting it. But I kind of understand what they're getting at, right? They're saying, they're articulating the difficulty of how do you convince somebody that something you think is, win-win is actually a win at all, if they can't feel it.
Exactly. Well, and that's a good conclusion note. Noah, thanks for taking the time with speaking to me today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks. Talk to you later.
Okay. Bye.